What kind of clothing could cost you your head? Why did kings ban football? And what do medieval laws have in common with modern internet comments? Today, we're diving into the strangest bans from the past and trying to understand why they ever made sense, or at least pretended to. If something in this story stirs something in you, let us know. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and we'll dig even deeper. You won't believe some of the laws people had to follow just a few centuries ago. Laws so strange, so oddly specific that they almost sound like jokes. But they were very real, and breaking them could mean a hefty fine, public humiliation, or even worse. Imagine being punished just because you wore the wrong color clothes or because you dared to eat garlic in a church. What does this tell us about the societies that made these rules? Why did they take such things seriously? Today, we're diving deep into some of the funniest, most bizarre laws from the past, laws that reveal not just the quirks of history, but the fears, beliefs, and values of entire civilizations. So get comfortable, because this journey into the absurd side of history is going to be both surprising and strangely entertaining. Let's start with one of the oldest known laws about clothing. In medieval England, the law was very clear. Commoners were forbidden from wearing clothes made from certain expensive fabrics or colors like purple or silk. These luxurious items were reserved only for the nobility. Purple dye, in particular, was so rare and expensive that it became a symbol of royal power. If a commoner dared to wear purple, they risked punishment for impersonating someone of higher rank. This law might sound ridiculous today, but it was about maintaining social order and clear distinctions between classes. It was a way for rulers to remind everyone of their place in society, visible right down to the color of their tunics. But the weirdness doesn't stop there. In 16th century France, there was a law banning people from eating garlic in church. The smell was said to be so strong and offensive that it disturbed the sanctity of the space. Imagine sitting in a solemn religious ceremony and someone's breath filled with pungent garlic. Not exactly peaceful, right? This law shows us how social etiquette and religious respect were enforced in very tangible ways. It also hints at the underlying fear that such disruptions could offend the divine or upset the spiritual atmosphere. Moving forward, let's talk about a law from colonial America. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was a law requiring everyone to attend church services. But what's more surprising is the punishment. Those who refused had to pay a fine. This wasn't just about religion, it was about controlling social behavior and unity. The church was the center of community life, and these laws force conformity in a way that feels very alien to modern ideas of freedom of belief. And here's a truly bizarre one from 18th century Scotland. It was illegal to wear a suit of armor within the city limits. This was to prevent knights or soldiers from intimidating the townsfolk or causing unrest. Considering armor was heavy and impractical for everyday life, this law likely targeted those who might have used their weapons or status to threaten others. Yet it's amusing to imagine someone trying to sneak through the city gates in full armor only to be stopped by the law. These examples barely scratch the surface of the world's strangest laws. There were rules about everything from who could carry swords to what colors were allowed during different seasons to even how loud people could talk on the streets. Some laws reveal attempts to control morality, others to maintain public order, and some simply reflect the superstitions and fears of the time. One particularly funny law came from Venice during the Renaissance period. It was illegal for men to wear high heels. Why? Because the narrow, crowded streets made high heels dangerous. They could cause accidents or damage the delicate flooring in palaces and important buildings. So men were literally banned from fashion choices that might make the city less safe or damage property. Fashion policing at its strangest. But what can these laws teach us today? First, they remind us that laws are never just about rules. They are reflections of culture, power, and social anxieties. What might seem silly now was once a serious matter. They also show how societies have tried to control not just actions but appearances, smells, even thoughts, through legislation. As we continue exploring these absurd historical laws, think about how much has changed and how some concerns remain. Human societies have always struggled with how to balance order, freedom, and respect, sometimes with hilarious results. Another curious example comes from ancient Rome, where the government regulated how much money could be spent on funerals. It sounds strange at first. Why control something so personal and somber? But in Roman society, funerals were a chance to show off wealth and status. Some families spent enormous sums on lavish ceremonies, hiring musicians, displaying expensive decorations, and organizing long processions through the city streets. The lawmakers feared this trend could spiral out of control, creating social tension and financial ruin. So, they set limits to keep funerals from becoming extravagant competitions. This law reveals a fascinating tension between personal expression and public order, a struggle still relevant today. Now, imagine walking down the streets of colonial Massachusetts where a law existed forbidding people from wearing masks unless it was during a carnival or special event. Why? The authorities worried that masked individuals could commit crimes and disappear without being identified. This might sound like an early version of modern anti-disguise laws, but it highlights how even centuries ago, communities grappled with trust and safety in public spaces. In medieval England, there was a law that forbade women from wearing men's clothing and men from wearing women's clothing. Cross-dressing was seen not only as socially unacceptable but also as a threat to the moral order. This law was enforced to maintain traditional gender roles which were deeply intertwined with the society's understanding of family, religion, and power. Punishments varied, but the message was clear: appearance mattered, and breaking these unwritten social codes was a crime. It's fascinating how clothing could be so politically charged and how dress codes became a tool of control. Meanwhile, in Japan during the Edo period, there was a law regulating the size and style of kimonos that people could wear. Different social classes had specific rules about fabric, color, and design. Breaking these rules could lead to fines or public shame. This system of dress codes reinforced the strict social hierarchy that governed every aspect of life. It's easy to see parallels between these regulations and the sumptuary laws of Europe, showing how societies worldwide have used clothing to symbolize and enforce social order. And what about laws that controlled behavior in public? In Victorian England, for example, there was a law called the Quiet Hours Rule, which forbade loud noises during certain times of day, including talking loudly or playing musical instruments. This law reflected the growing concern for public decorum and respect for neighbors. It also mirrored the social ideals of the era: order, discipline, and civility. Imagine living in a city where you had to constantly monitor your noise levels or risk punishment. Now, consider a law from early 20th century America that prohibited wearing hats indoors in public buildings. Hats were an important part of fashion back then, but they were seen as a sign of respect to remove them when entering a building. This law codified what was often an unspoken social rule, ensuring that people showed proper manners. It's a reminder of how customs can become formalized into law and how even small actions carry social significance. Some laws from the past seem outright bizarre because they regulate very specific and odd behaviors. In 19th century France, it was illegal to name a pig Napoleon. This law was born out of respect for the former emperor, preventing people from using his name in ways considered disrespectful or mocking. It shows how laws sometimes protect symbolic figures, controlling language and humor. Similarly, in ancient Sparta, there was a law that forbade citizens from eating certain foods considered too luxurious or soft, like pork. Spartans prized simplicity and toughness, and their laws enforced these values, making sure citizens lived disciplined, austere lives. This law wasn't just about diet, it was about shaping a culture of resilience and strength, a fascinating example of how food can be politicized. Laws that regulate smell might be the strangest of all. Apart from the garlic ban in churches, some towns in medieval Europe had laws against foul odors. In one English town, it was illegal to dump waste in the streets, punishable by fines. While this may seem obvious today, it reflects early public health concerns and the struggle to maintain hygiene in crowded cities. Some laws even banned people from carrying smelly fish or cheese through the streets during the summer months to prevent offending the neighbors. The variety of these laws highlights how governments have long tried to legislate everyday life, from what we wear to how we behave to even how we smell. And while some laws seem silly now, they often addressed real concerns of their times, whether about public order, morality, or safety. As you listen to these stories, it's interesting to reflect on which modern laws might seem strange to people in the future. Perhaps future generations will laugh at today's rules about technology, speech, or even personal appearance. History shows us that laws are never fixed or purely rational. They are shaped by culture, fear, humor, and sometimes pure whimsy. Let's take a closer look at laws that regulated social interactions, especially in public spaces. In early modern Europe, there were strict rules about who could speak to whom and when. For example, in some towns, it was illegal for lower-class individuals to address nobility without permission. Even simple acts like greeting or making eye contact could be considered disrespectful or even dangerous if done incorrectly. These laws were a way to maintain rigid social hierarchies, reinforcing the idea that power was visible and enforceable down to everyday gestures. In Renaissance Italy, the city of Florence passed a law forbidding citizens from wearing masks except during official celebrations or carnivals. This was partly due to concerns about crime, people hiding their identities to commit theft or violence, but it also reveals anxieties about anonymity and trust in public life. Masks created a sense of mystery and potential threat, disrupting social order. So, for most of the year, faces had to be visible to ensure accountability and social cohesion. Moving to the British Isles in the 18th century, there was a peculiar law against excessive dressing. This law targeted wealthy women who wore excessively large wigs or ostentatious dresses, which were seen as a sign of vanity and moral decay. Authorities feared such extravagance would destabilize society by encouraging greed and frivolity. While it might seem absurd, it reflects a broader concern about maintaining social values through appearance, a theme common throughout history. In the American colonies, some towns had laws dictating the hours during which shops could operate. For instance, it was illegal to open a tavern or pub before a certain time in the morning or to serve alcohol on Sundays. These laws weren't just about controlling commerce but about enforcing religious observance and community standards. They reveal how tightly law and religion were intertwined, with legal codes reflecting the dominant moral beliefs of the time. One of the most peculiar laws comes from 19th century England, where it was illegal to carry a plank along a pavement. The idea was to prevent accidents and blockages on narrow sidewalks. This law sounds oddly specific, but it highlights how urban life brought new challenges that required innovative legal solutions. As cities grew crowded and busy, regulating everyday behavior became essential to keep order and safety. Across the globe, there were also laws related to speech and expression. In 17th century France, it was illegal to insult or mock the king in any way. The penalties were severe, sometimes even death. This law, known as lèse-majesté, was designed to protect the dignity of the monarchy and discourage dissent. It shows how laws have been used to suppress free speech and maintain power structures throughout history. At the same time, humor was also subject to legal restrictions. In medieval England, jesters were sometimes punished if their jokes offended the wrong people. While jesters were allowed to mock nobles and kings to some extent, crossing certain lines could lead to exile or worse. This delicate balance between freedom and control over humor reflects society's complex relationship with power and satire. Laws regarding property and personal rights could also be surprisingly strange. In colonial New England, a law prohibited fencing in land without permission from neighbors. This was to prevent conflicts and ensure communal cooperation. However, in some cases, these laws led to bizarre disputes over inches of land or the right to pick berries from a neighbor's tree. Such laws reveal how property rights have long been a source of tension and humor. Animal laws, too, could be both practical and peculiar. In medieval England, it was illegal to let your pigs roam free in the streets. Free-roaming pigs could cause damage to crops and property, so owners were required to keep them penned. Failure to do so could result in fines or the pig being confiscated. In some places, the law even mandated that pigs wear a bell so their owners could find them easily. This mix of practicality and whimsy paints a vivid picture of everyday life centuries ago. Similarly, in 16th century Scotland, there was a law against singing offensive songs in public. This law aimed to prevent unrest and insult among neighbors, showing how even music and poetry were regulated to maintain peace. It also reflects the power of words and art to challenge authority and the corresponding efforts to control them. The strangest laws often arose from superstitions or attempts to control fate. For instance, in some European towns, it was illegal to whistle at night because it was believed to summon evil spirits or witches. These laws, while based on irrational fears, offer fascinating insights into the mindset of past societies. They remind us that laws are not only practical tools but also cultural artifacts shaped by beliefs and fears. As we explore these laws, it becomes clear that many were attempts to shape not just behavior but the very identity of communities. Whether through dress codes, speech restrictions, or odd bans on everyday activities, these rules tell stories about how people understood themselves and their world. In modern times, many of these laws have been repealed or forgotten, but some still linger in the form of blue laws or local ordinances. The legacy of these strange laws challenges us to think critically about the laws we live by today and how they reflect our own fears, values, and desires for order. It was the height of summer in Florence. The sun beat down on cobbled streets, the air thick with perfume, sweat, and tension. A young merchant strutted through the Piazza della Signoria, his sleeves bursting with silk, his collar lined with gold. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be envied. But in that exact moment, he was breaking the law. A sumptuary law. He didn't care. Not until the city guards approached. In Renaissance Florence, fashion wasn't just about taste, it was a threat. Silk, brocade, even the width of your sleeve could get you fined, shamed, or worse. These laws weren't about modesty. They were about control. About making sure no one forgot who held power and who didn't. Why were people so afraid of someone dressing above their station? Because clothes were armor not of metal but of ambition. And ambition, in the wrong hands, could upend everything. Florence wasn't alone. Across Europe, governments feared fabric. In England, laws dictated who could wear fur, who could wear velvet, and who had to settle for wool. A butcher wearing satin wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. Because if a butcher could look like a baron, what stopped him from acting like one? But here's the twist. These laws failed. Every time. Because humans always find a way. They hemmed velvet into their linings. Sewed pearls inside coats. Painted cheap leather to look like snakeskin. It became a game of cat and mouse, desire versus discipline. And the more they banned, the more people wanted to rebel. Let's travel north now. Medieval Scotland. It's evening. The marketplace is closing. A man finishes his ale and climbs onto a wooden platform. He begins to sing. It's a bawdy tune, clever, biting, aimed squarely at a local noble who raised taxes the week before. The crowd laughs. But not for long. Guards appear. The man is dragged away. His crime? Singing without permission. There was a law little known but ruthlessly enforced banning public songs that insulted authority. Even melodies could become weapons. A clever verse could destroy a reputation, challenge power, ignite rebellion. So the law stepped in to silence them before the final note. But ask yourself, what kind of society is afraid of songs? There's something almost desperate in it. A fear not of violence, but of laughter. Of being made small in the public eye. And that fear, that need to protect dignity at any cost, crops up again and again in the strangest of laws. Take Napoleon, for example. France. 1800s. It became illegal to name your pig Napoleon. Yes, your pig. Why? Because someone did it as a joke. And the government wasn't laughing. A pig waddling around with the name of an emperor? That was mockery. That was revolution in miniature. And they feared it. Not because a pig had power, but because words did. It's funny until you realize what it meant. That power was so brittle, so desperate to be taken seriously that even a joke could threaten it. The state had to fight not just rebellion but ridicule. And that tells you everything. Now picture this, London, 1850. A man is fined for carrying a plank. No, really. He was walking down a busy street with a wooden beam on his shoulder and someone complained. The law said it was a public nuisance. And in some ways it was. Streets were tight, carriages everywhere, people packed shoulder to shoulder. But here's the bigger question. Why did the government need to legislate it? Because the city had changed. It was no longer a village where people knew each other. It was anonymous, overcrowded, modern, and in modernity, chaos becomes dangerous. So the state tried to control it piece by piece, even if that meant banning planks. It sounds ridiculous, but it's the same impulse behind every odd law we've seen. The garlic ban in churches? That wasn't about garlic. That was about controlling bodies and boundaries. The clothing laws? Not about fabric, but status. The song bans? Not about music, but fear of truth. And this leads us to a darker realization. The strangest laws often reveal the deepest insecurities. They show what a society fears most. Too much freedom. Too much laughter. Too much blending between the classes. Too much smell. Too much sound. Too much visibility. So they legislate the margins. The details. The things that seem trivial but aren't. Because power lives in the details. And it always has. It was the height of summer in Florence. The sun beat down on cobbled streets, the air thick with perfume, sweat, and tension. A young merchant strutted through the Piazza della Signoria, his sleeves bursting with silk, his collar lined with gold. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be envied. But in that exact moment, he was breaking the law. A sumptuary law. He didn't care. Not until the city guards approached. In Renaissance Florence, fashion wasn't just about taste, it was a threat. Silk, brocade, even the width of your sleeve could get you fined, shamed, or worse. These laws weren't about modesty. They were about control. About making sure no one forgot who held power and who didn't. Why were people so afraid of someone dressing above their station? Because clothes were armor not of metal but of ambition. And ambition, in the wrong hands, could upend everything. Florence wasn't alone. Across Europe, governments feared fabric. In England, laws dictated who could wear fur, who could wear velvet, and who had to settle for wool. A butcher wearing satin wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. Because if a butcher could look like a baron, what stopped him from acting like one? But here's the twist. These laws failed. Every time. Because humans always find a way. They hemmed velvet into their linings. Sewed pearls inside coats. Painted cheap leather to look like snakeskin. It became a game of cat and mouse, desire versus discipline. And the more they banned, the more people wanted to rebel. Let's travel north now. Medieval Scotland. It's evening. The marketplace is closing. A man finishes his ale and climbs onto a wooden platform. He begins to sing. It's a bawdy tune, clever, biting, aimed squarely at a local noble who raised taxes the week before. The crowd laughs. But not for long. Guards appear. The man is dragged away. His crime? Singing without permission. There was a law little known but ruthlessly enforced banning public songs that insulted authority. Even melodies could become weapons. A clever verse could destroy a reputation, challenge power, ignite rebellion. So the law stepped in to silence them before the final note. But ask yourself, what kind of society is afraid of songs? There's something almost desperate in it. A fear not of violence, but of laughter. Of being made small in the public eye. And that fear, that need to protect dignity at any cost, crops up again and again in the strangest of laws. Take Napoleon, for example. France. 1800s. It became illegal to name your pig Napoleon. Yes, your pig. Why? Because someone did it as a joke. And the government wasn't laughing. A pig waddling around with the name of an emperor? That was mockery. That was revolution in miniature. And they feared it. Not because a pig had power, but because words did. It's funny until you realize what it meant. That power was so brittle, so desperate to be taken seriously that even a joke could threaten it. The state had to fight not just rebellion but ridicule. And that tells you everything. Now picture this. London. 1850. A man is fined for carrying a plank. No, really. He was walking down a busy street with a wooden beam on his shoulder and someone complained. The law said it was a public nuisance. And in some ways it was. Streets were tight, carriages everywhere, people packed shoulder to shoulder. But here's the bigger question. Why did the government need to legislate it? Because the city had changed. It was no longer a village where people knew each other. It was anonymous, overcrowded, modern, and in modernity, chaos becomes dangerous. So the state tried to control it piece by piece, even if that meant banning planks. It sounds ridiculous, but it's the same impulse behind every odd law we've seen. The garlic ban in churches? That wasn't about garlic. That was about controlling bodies and boundaries. The clothing laws? Not about fabric, but status. The song bans? Not about music, but fear of truth. And this leads us to a darker realization. The strangest laws often reveal the deepest insecurities. They show what a society fears most. Too much freedom. Too much laughter. Too much blending between the classes. Too much smell. Too much sound. Too much visibility. So they legislate the margins. The details. The things that seem trivial but aren't. Because power lives in the details. And it always has. Paris. The year is 1624. A woman steps into a bakery. She points to a loaf of bread, soft, fresh, golden. She smiles, pays, and walks out. The baker is arrested the next day. His crime? Selling bread made with white flour to someone outside the nobility. You heard that right. There were laws regulating who could eat what. In some places, the color of your bread revealed your class. The darker the bread, the poorer the eater. White bread was considered refined, pure, reserved for the elite. If a commoner was caught with it, they could be questioned, fined, even imprisoned. It seems absurd, but the logic was cold and calculated. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was identity. Control who eats what, and you control how people see themselves and each other. The rules didn't end at bread. In 17th century Spain, certain spices were restricted to the upper class. Clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, common in modern kitchens, were symbols of status. In one village, a cook was dragged into court for using saffron in a wedding dish. The bride wasn't noble. The court ruled it an act of culinary impersonation. Think about that. Flavor was criminalized. Taste became territory, because even the scent of a dish could be dangerous. It suggested someone had crossed a line, that someone, somewhere, didn't know their place. Now shift the scene. Small-town Germany. Winter. A local healer is accused of keeping a cat. Not just any cat. A black one. To us, this sounds like superstition. But the local ordinances at the time included lines about the keeping of suspicious animals. Suspicious animals. Why? Because animals, especially cats, toads, crows, were often linked to witchcraft. And laws didn't just ban sorcery. They banned the tools, the signs, the symbols. The cat was just an animal. But in the eyes of the law, it was a whisper, a possibility, a threat. People were hanged for less. And here's where it gets disturbing. These weren't laws made in panic. They were formal, written, enforced. They were part of a system that needed fear to survive. Fear of rebellion. Fear of blasphemy. Fear of the unknown. So they wrote fear into the law. They outlawed night whistling. Outlawed wearing red shoes on Sundays. Outlawed walking a goat through a cemetery. Each law sounds like folklore. But it was real. And the deeper truth? When power becomes paranoid, it turns everyday life into a minefield. Even something as simple as walking down the street could get you in trouble. In 19th century New York, a woman was fined for loitering without intent. What does that even mean? She was standing on a corner, not selling anything, not asking for anything, just existing. But that was enough to draw suspicion. Because people in power wanted the streets orderly, predictable, clean. If you didn't fit in class, in gender, in behavior, you became a problem. Sometimes the law didn't need a reason. It just needed an excuse. Let's go back a little earlier. England. 1604. A man is arrested for walking home barefoot. Bare feet were associated with vagabonds, beggars, criminals. If you had no shoes, they assumed you had no morals. The law didn't say no bare feet. It said no suspicious conduct. But everyone knew what that meant. This is where law bleeds into culture. Into bias. Into fear disguised as justice. And we still see it today, don't we? Laws that seem neutral but hit certain people harder. Loitering. Noise. Appearance. Smell. All regulated, all policed. Not because they're harmful, but because they challenge comfort. They disrupt an image of control. That's what makes these strange old laws feel eerily modern. Because they weren't just about order. They were about silencing something deeper. Chaos. Difference. Ambiguity. Things that couldn't be measured but could be punished. The night was cold and silent in a small village deep in the Bavarian Alps. A lone traveler wrapped tightly in a coarse cloak made his way through narrow lanes, the only sound his breath clouding the icy air. Suddenly, a lantern flickered in the distance. A village guard stepped out, blocking his path. "You," the guard said, voice low and suspicious. "Where are your shoes?" The traveler looked down at his worn boots, patched and mud-stained. "I have shoes," he replied, "but I removed them to cross the river." The guard sneered. "No excuses. Barefoot is a sign of vagrancy. You'll come with me." And so began a night in the village jail. For walking barefoot or appearing suspicious, the traveler was accused of being a vagabond, a potential thief, a danger to order. This wasn't just paranoia. It was law. For centuries, laws have targeted the invisible lines that separate us from them. These lines are drawn not on maps but on skin, shoes, smells, even the way you carry yourself. In medieval Europe, a person's smell could be used against them. If you smelled bad, you were assumed lazy, immoral, unclean. Some towns went so far as to pass laws banning offensive odors in the streets. Imagine being arrested for how you smelled. The stakes were high. Because smell wasn't just a nuisance, it was a social weapon. In cities packed tight with humanity where people lived on top of each other, odor was a sign of status or failure. Nobles bathed often, used perfumes and scented gloves. The poor could not afford such luxuries. Their sweat and smoke mingled in narrow alleys, marking them as other. One story tells of a merchant in 16th century Venice who was fined because his clothes smelled too strongly of garlic. Garlic was believed to repel evil spirits, but also to offend the delicate noses of the aristocracy. He was ordered to wash his garments or face harsher punishment. Why does this matter? Because controlling who could smell clean, or at all, was a way of controlling presence, identity, and dignity. And the fear ran deeper. What if the unclean smelled so bad they scared away the elite? What if they spread disease? What if their bodies betrayed their poverty and desperation? It wasn't just about hygiene. It was about exclusion. Laws targeting smells echo today's social prejudices. Think about judgments passed on clothes, on perfumes, on personal habits. The invisible barriers remain. But sometimes the strangest laws came from attempts to protect the vulnerable, or at least what rulers saw as vulnerable. In 18th century France, a law forbade women from wearing high heels above a certain height unless granted special permission. The official reason was safety. High heels could cause accidents. But beneath that was fear. Fear that women's appearance could be too powerful, too distracting, too rebellious. Shoes became a symbol of control over women's bodies and behavior. To regulate footwear was to regulate freedom. And it wasn't limited to women. In some German towns, men were forbidden from wearing hats indoors. This wasn't just a custom, it was a law enforced to ensure respect towards superiors and God. Removing your hat was a sign of submission. Keep it on and you risked insult or punishment. Picture the pressure. Every movement, every choice under watchful eyes. The invisible chains of expectation woven into fabric and flesh. But laws like these also created cracks, spaces for rebellion. A man wearing a forbidden hat could become a hero, a symbol of resistance. A woman refusing to lower her heels might challenge the very order that sought to bind her. And here lies the power of these seemingly trivial laws. They're not trivial at all. They are the battlegrounds where identity, power, and freedom clash. When the state tries to control the small, it exposes its greatest fear, losing control altogether. So next time you hear about an old, strange law, remember this. Behind the oddity is a story of conflict. Of people trying to live, to express, to survive. Against rules that sought to silence them. And in those stories, we find echoes of our own struggles today. Because power still lives in the details. And freedom is still worth fighting for. The year was 1745 in a bustling Dutch port city. Ships from around the world docked daily, unloading spices, silks, and stories from distant lands. Amid the crowd, a young boy darted through the market, clutching a small loaf of bread stolen from a stall. He was hungry, desperate, invisible to most except to the watchful eyes of the city's magistrates. A law had been passed not long before. No one under the age of 12 was allowed to enter the marketplace alone after dusk. It was meant to curb theft, yes, but also to keep the streets orderly. The boy was caught, dragged before the magistrate, and sentenced to a harsh punishment, whipping and forced labor. Why such cruelty for a child? Because laws often reflect fear. Fear of disorder. Fear that small acts of defiance could unravel the social fabric. Fear that the poor, the hungry, the marginalized might rise and shake the foundations of power. But laws targeting children reveal something deeper. They are about control over the future. By policing the youngest, rulers sought to shape generations, teach them obedience early, suppress their voices before they could speak. Now imagine the boy's world. The smell of salt and fish in the air. The clatter of wooden carts. The flicker of lanterns casting long shadows. And the cold grip of law closing in on him like a cage. His crime was hunger. His punishment, a warning. This conflict between survival and authority is a thread woven through history's strangest laws. In colonial America, for instance, a law prohibited Native Americans from wearing their traditional clothing in public. This wasn't just cultural suppression. It was a way to erase identity, to force assimilation under the guise of order. A feather headdress wasn't just decoration, it was history, honor, resistance. Taking it away was taking away power. Similarly, in 19th century Britain, laws restricted who could gather in public spaces. The working class was limited in their ability to organize or protest. A simple meeting could be declared illegal assembly. The law was a weapon used to silence voices that threatened the status quo. Here's the striking truth. Strange laws are often not about what they say on paper. They're about who they target, who they silence, who they exclude. Every curious regulation, every bizarre ban is a thread in a larger tapestry, a story about control and rebellion. And it forces us to ask, what parts of our lives today are controlled by invisible laws? What freedoms do we take for granted? What tiny acts of defiance still ripple beneath the surface? Because history teaches us this. When laws try to cage the small details of life, they reveal the deep anxieties of power. And where there is control, there is resistance. Where there is oppression, there is hope. And in that tension between law and life, our stories live. Night falls over Edo, the bustling capital of Japan in the early 1700s. Lanterns flicker in the narrow alleys, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A kimono-clad man strides confidently through the crowd, his geta clacking sharply on the wooden planks. But his footwear catches the eye of a patrol guard. Stop, the guard calls out. Your geta are too tall. That's forbidden. The man freezes. In Edo, the height of geta, those wooden sandals, was regulated by law. Too high, and you risked being accused of vanity, or worse, disrespect to social order. The authorities believed excessive height disrupted harmony and invited danger in the crowded streets. The man protests, but the guard insists. He is fined, shamed. Why such control over shoes? Because even something as simple as walking could become a statement, an act of rebellion or conformity, a reflection of status or an invitation to disorder. This wasn't unique to Japan. Across the world, controlling footwear meant controlling movement, visibility, identity. In 16th century France, a law banned women from wearing large hats at court unless they were of noble birth. The hat was more than fashion, it was power and influence. Too large a hat was a challenge to authority. In England, men's collars were similarly regulated. The wider and more elaborate the collar, the more dangerous it was considered. It drew attention, and attention was power. This obsession with small details reveals something profound. Control is never about the obvious. It's about shaping the invisible boundaries between classes, genders, freedoms. It's about policing the gestures, the scents, the sounds that speak louder than words. But humans resist. In secret rooms and hidden gardens, women wore forbidden hats. Men tucked elaborate collars beneath cloaks. Small rebellions, quiet but persistent. And here's the paradox. The more the state tries to control these tiny expressions, the more they become symbols of freedom. Because power fears what it cannot predict or command. So it fights to ban shoes, collars, hats. But freedom lives in the defiant step, the raised collar, the daring hat. The struggle plays out every day, in every street, every city. Invisible battles over who can walk where, how, and why. And in those battles, history's strangest laws come alive, not as curiosities, but as mirrors reflecting our deepest conflicts. The year is 1787. In a small village nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany, an old widow named Maria tends to her garden. She grows herbs, vegetables, and flowers, all for her modest table and the neighbors who come seeking cures for ailments. Maria is known as a healer, a woman wise in the ways of nature. But whispers circulate darker than the night shadows. A new law has been passed, one forbidding anyone from practicing medicine without a license from the city's council. Maria has no license. She never sought one. The council fears unregulated healing. They fear power slipping beyond their grasp. One evening, soldiers come knocking. They seize her herbs. They threaten imprisonment. This law, cloaked in concern for public health, is also a weapon to control knowledge, to centralize power in distant halls. It's a pattern seen again and again. From Europe to the Americas, from ancient times to modern days, laws regulate not just actions, but ideas. Who can heal? Who can teach? Who can speak? A powerful metaphor unfolds here. The strangest laws often cloak a deeper war over knowledge, freedom, and voice. Maria's story isn't unique. In 19th century England, for example, there were laws forbidding women from attending universities. Education was a battleground. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, laws restricted printing presses, limiting the spread of books and ideas. Every restriction chipped away at personal freedom. But people found ways to resist. Secret schools, underground presses, whispered lessons in hidden rooms. The law tried to cage knowledge, but knowledge found cracks. And the cracks grew wider. The struggle between authority and freedom repeats itself through history's strangest laws. They are more than oddities. They are monuments to the human spirit's fight against control. So next time you hear about a bizarre or outdated law, listen closely. Because beneath the surface there is a story of people daring to live, to learn, to be free. And those stories remind us of one truth. Freedom is never given. It is taken, fought for, protected. And it often begins with the smallest act, a forbidden herb, a banned book, a quiet word. Vienna, 1812. A quiet street on the city's edge. A man named Joseph, an aging violinist who once played for royalty, now earns a living playing for weddings and funerals. One evening, as twilight slips across the rooftops, he tunes his strings and begins to play in a small public square. He plays softly at first. A lullaby, gentle and mournful. People gather. But within minutes, a constable arrives. "You're violating the municipal noise law," the officer snaps. "No unsanctioned melodies after sundown." Joseph's hands tremble. His music, his lifeline, is declared unlawful. The law had been introduced during wartime to prevent gatherings under the guise of security. But it lingered. It grew teeth. Now even music could be dangerous. Think about that. A law not against violence or theft, but against beauty. And it wasn't the only one. Throughout Europe, laws cropped up regulating public singing, humming, even whistling. Why? Because sound carries emotion. Emotion inspires action. And action threatens control. When people sing, they connect. They remember. They hope. And for those in power, uncontrolled hope is frightening. Music has always walked the line between joy and defiance. In the ghettos of Nazi-occupied Poland, it was illegal to play certain instruments. But musicians played anyway. In secret. In cellars. In the shadows. Because even when freedom is taken, rhythm remains. These bands weren't really about noise. They were about silencing the soul. And yet, every band invites rebellion. A whispered tune becomes a symbol. A forbidden melody becomes a weapon. Because even in silence, memory hums. And history reminds us what they try to ban often reveals what they fear most. Joy, grief, connection. Now picture a different scene. Istanbul, late 1800s. A man walks into a coffee house, a small, smoky space filled with storytellers, chess players, poets. But as he opens the door, he sees a sign. No political talk. No readings of history. No poetry recitations. The law had arrived quietly, first as a suggestion, then as decree. Because rulers had learned something dangerous, coffeehouses stirred thought. People gathered. They discussed ideas. They remembered past injustices. They imagined futures. So the law moved in, not with soldiers but with silence. Ban the stories. Ban the games. Ban the laughter after dark. It's a familiar pattern. Strange laws are often born where the powerful feel insecure. Where they sense the tremble of change. Where the air is thick with ideas they cannot predict. And so they outlaw chessboards. And books. And music. And shoes. And colors. And scents. But here's the irony. Every ban makes the forbidden more powerful. Every restriction lights a spark. Every whisper becomes a roar. Because when the law says you cannot, the human spirit replies, watch me. So no, these strange laws were never really about odd habits or quirky traditions. They were shields. They were walls built out of fear. Fear of difference. Fear of movement. Fear of the human mind unchained. But fear doesn't last forever. Ideas slip through cracks. Songs return. Shoes are worn again. And in every corner of history where silence was enforced, you'll find the echo of a voice that refused to be quiet. Paris, 1306. The city is restless. Tension thickens the air like smoke. In a cramped Jewish quarter near the Seine, candles burn low into the night. Word spreads like fire. A new royal edict has just been posted. From now on, Jews are forbidden to own gold, silver, or precious stones. Possession will be punished with confiscation, sometimes imprisonment. The pretext? To curb usury, to protect Christians from debt. But everyone knows what this is. It's theft legalized. The law is a weapon, sharpened not to protect order, but to destroy lives. Imagine being forced to hand over your wedding ring, your daughter's earrings, a bracelet passed through generations. Not for any crime, but because of your name, your identity. This wasn't an isolated moment. Laws like this were tools of erasure. In medieval Spain, laws banned Jews and Muslims from wearing certain colors. Red, blue, and green were too noble, reserved for Christians. Others were forced to wear badges or hats that marked them as different, visible at a glance. Think about that. You wake up one morning and your clothes are now criminal. Your very fabric illegal. What does it do to the soul when the state criminalizes your reflection? These strange laws weren't about justice. They were about branding. About stripping people of dignity and marking them as other. But here's the truth no edict could erase. People adapt. People resist. Some embroidered stars with gold thread. Others wore the forbidden colors anyway under cloaks, on cuffs, in secret. A silent act of rebellion sewn into every seam. And rebellion wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was survival itself. A woman named Miriam in 14th century Toledo ran a secret school in her cellar. Teaching Hebrew, history, arithmetic. Each lesson a whisper against erasure. Each child a living answer to oppression. The law tried to erase names. Miriam remembered them. The law tried to erase voices. She taught them to speak. This is the power behind the strangest laws, not just their cruelty, but the courage they inspired. The stories they reveal. The humanity they couldn't crush. Now travel east. Moscow, 1722. Peter the Great issues a decree all noblemen must shave their beards or pay a heavy tax. The goal? To westernize Russia. To push it toward the fashions of Europe. But for Russian Orthodox men, the beard wasn't just hair, it was sacred. A symbol of piety, manhood, dignity. So when the decree passed, outrage swept through the cities and countryside. Beards were sheared in public squares. Men wept as razors scraped their faces clean. Others paid the tax, hiding their faces in shame. But here's the irony. The state even minted special beard tokens, small metal discs that proved the tax had been paid. They read, "The beard is taxed." So even as it tried to erase the beard, the law ended up preserving its importance. Because when the state targets symbols, it only sharpens them. What it tries to kill becomes legend. Men wore their beard tokens like medals. Children passed down the stories. And to this day, Russian folklore tells of the time when beards were hunted, when a man's face was not his own. Again and again, we see this truth. The stranger the law, the deeper the fear it conceals. The odder the restriction, the more fragile the regime that enforces it. Because tyranny rarely begins with fire and chains. It begins with fabric, with songs, with silence, with hair. But the human spirit is cunning. And history is a record of its clever defiance. You can outlaw scent, but someone will wear it anyway. You can ban songs, but someone will hum in the dark. You can shave the beard, but the soul remembers. Cairo, 1009. The sun bleeds gold over stone rooftops as the muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. But this morning is different. In the alleys, a quiet dread pulses under the sound. A new decree has arrived from the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. Christians and Jews are forbidden to ride horses. From now on, they must ride donkeys or walk barefoot if possible. Why? Because horses were symbols of dignity, status, speed. And the Caliph wanted submission. He wanted visible humiliation, a hierarchy marked by hooves and dust. It was not about transportation. It was about who looked down and who looked up. A Christian merchant, respected, educated, must now walk behind the same officials who once bowed to him in court. He steps in manure. His robes gather dirt. His dignity crumbles. This is what the law wanted, a quiet erasure, one step at a time. But humans are stubborn. Some walked barefoot proudly, defiantly. Others rode donkeys dressed in bright silks, mocking the law with joy. In private, they told stories. They kept records. They remembered. Because memory is resistance. And that resistance becomes legend. Centuries later, those same laws are footnotes in dusty books. But the names of those who endured them? Still spoken. Still honored. Now shift your gaze, Imperial China, Song Dynasty, 12th century. A woman stands in her home adjusting the tight wraps around her feet. She winces. She bleeds. But she continues. Not because of a formal law, but a law more insidious. Custom. A foot to be beautiful must be small. Crushed. Deformed. The practice of foot binding wasn't legislated, but it was enforced through another kind of power, cultural law. Break it and you are unworthy. Unmarriageable. Shamed. Imagine the layers of silence. The mother who binds her daughter's feet while weeping. The daughter who hides the pain to earn love. The entire society pretending it is beauty, not violence. And yet some resisted. One noblewoman famous in the court refused to bind her feet. She never married. She wrote poetry, biting, defiant, unforgettable. Her name was Jiao. She became a symbol of rebellion centuries later when foot binding was finally condemned. Because even when a law isn't written in ink, it's written in scars. But every scar is also a story. And stories break chains. Let's move again. New York City, 1904. The subway is still new. Electric lights buzz overhead. And in a Brooklyn police station, a man is arrested. His crime? Wearing women's clothing in public. The anti-cross-dressing laws in America at the time were strict and vague. You had to wear at least 3 articles of clothing appropriate to your sex. If not, you could be fined, jailed, or worse. The law wasn't about fashion. It was about identity. About fear of the unknown. About preserving a rigid world where men were men, women were women, and everyone else didn't exist. But people existed anyway. They dressed. They danced. They built communities underground, literally and figuratively. Drag balls emerged in Harlem. Secret gatherings. Hidden codes. A language of defiance made from sequins and eyeliner. Because when the world tells you you do not belong, dressing up becomes survival. Performance becomes protest. These strange laws against heels, against hats, against who you are weren't about public safety. They were about containment. But nothing true stays hidden forever. The subways carried secrets, and one by one, they spilled into daylight. Stonewall. Pride. Change. The law fell. The people remained. Athens, 5th century BCE. The city buzzes with philosophers debating in the agora. But amid the chatter, a peculiar law casts a shadow. No citizen may wear purple robes unless granted special permission by the assembly. Purple dye is rare and expensive, a symbol of wealth and power. To don purple without approval is seen as an act of arrogance, a threat to social order. One day, a wealthy merchant named Demetrios arrives at the market draped in rich purple. The crowd murmurs. Officials confront him, accusing him of flaunting his status. Demetrios argues he earned it fairly, but the law is clear. He is fined and forced to remove the robe. This law, seemingly trivial, is a tool of control. Purple is more than color, it's power, prestige, identity. Restricting it restricts ambition. Across the Aegean, in Sparta, the law is stricter. Spartans prized austerity and equality among citizens, forbidding luxury or excess. A man caught wearing elaborate clothing risked public shaming or harsher punishment. Why such obsession with dress? Because fabric speaks louder than words. It declares who belongs and who does not. Now imagine the inner turmoil of Demetrios. He walks through the streets, stripped of his robe, his pride wounded. Is his ambition a threat or a right? This tension between individuality and society echoes through time. Jump to Scandinavia, 12th century. A rural village in what is now Sweden. A law forbids women from owning land independently. Land is power. Without it, women's voices are muted. Yet, the village healer, Ingrid, secretly manages a small plot. She grows herbs and treats the sick. She hides the deeds and trades them in the black market. Ingrid's double life is a balancing act of survival and defiance. Her story is a silent rebellion against laws that try to erase women's independence. She risks arrest, exile, but she persists. Because control over land means control over life. Fast forward to medieval Europe, church law. Here, a curious decree forbids priests from marrying. Celibacy is enforced not just as religious purity, but as a means to consolidate church power. Priests with families might pass wealth to children. Without families, they remain dependent on the church hierarchy. This law created secret scandals, hidden children, and whispers in cloisters. Imagine a priest torn between duty and desire, faith and love. A man forced to deny a basic human bond for the sake of institution. And yet, throughout history, many priests broke the vow in silence. The law cracked under human needs. The strangest laws often reveal this. Beneath the surface of rigid control lies a tide of human contradiction. Ambition, love, identity, survival. The laws may bind bodies and words, but they cannot bind hearts. And in those cracks, history's richest stories emerge. In the dense jungles of the Maya civilization around 600 AD, the city of Tikal pulses with life. Amid towering pyramids and vibrant markets, a law governs something surprising: the length of one's hair. Nobles are required to keep their hair long, flowing as a sign of status and connection to the gods. Commoners must keep theirs short, a mark of humility. One day, a young commoner named Kin decides to grow his hair long in secret, inspired by stories of heroes and divine kings. Each morning, he hides beneath his cloak, letting his hair fall free in quiet rebellion. But hair, like many things, is never just hair. When the city's guards discover Kin's defiance, he faces harsh punishment, not for vanity, but for challenging the rigid social order. This seemingly strange law masks a deeper fear that boundaries between classes will blur, that power will be questioned. Now fast forward to the great empires of West Africa. In the kingdom of Dahomey, the Amazons, an elite all-female military corps, are forbidden from marrying or bearing children. The law demands total dedication to the state, to war. Personal life is sacrificed for loyalty. But behind these harsh rules are women who embody strength, agency, and resistance within a system that both empowers and confines them. One Amazon warrior, Nawi, secretly writes poems about love and loss hidden in her helmet. She dreams of a world where duty and desire coexist. Her story reminds us that laws, no matter how strict, cannot fully contain the human heart. Across the ocean, in the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, another strange law grips the city. Public dancing after sunset is forbidden. The rulers fear that nighttime gatherings fuel rebellion and disrupt order. The streets, once alive with rhythm and fire, grow silent under the law's shadow. Yet the people find ways to resist. Secret dances beneath moonlight. Hidden drums in forest clearings. Because rhythm and movement are lifeblood, impossible to ban completely. In every culture, every era, strange laws have tried to draw lines around identity, freedom, and expression. And yet, those lines are never fixed. They shift, blur, break. Because humans are restless. We push boundaries. We seek connection. We rebel through small acts, growing hair, writing poems, dancing in the dark. And through these acts, the strangest laws become stories of courage and survival. History teaches us this: when laws try to limit who we are, they reveal what we value most. Freedom, identity, hope. And in that revelation lies our greatest power. Rome, 1st century BCE. The city hums with politics and intrigue. But among the Senate's decrees, a peculiar law stands out: no man may wear a gold ring unless he is a senator or granted special permission. The ring is more than jewelry, it's a symbol of power, status, and influence. A young plebeian named Marcus, newly wealthy from trade, flaunts a gold ring at a public feast. The senators see it as a challenge, an affront to their authority. Marcus is summoned and forced to remove the ring, his pride wounded. This law is not about fashion, it's about hierarchy. Control over who can display power. But Marcus's defiance sparks whispers. If a merchant can rise, what does that mean for the old order? Power is never just about laws. It's about perception. Now consider another law, this one from feudal Japan, Edo period. Samurai are forbidden from wearing swords in the capital unless on official duty. The sword, the soul of the samurai, symbolizes honor and status. Restricting its public display is a way to control potential rebellion. Yet many samurai find subtle ways to carry hidden blades or symbols of their status. The law tries to silence, but honor whispers. And what of women during the Renaissance in Europe? A strange law forbids women from wearing masks in public masquerades unless accompanied by a man. The mask represents mystery and freedom, a chance to escape rigid social roles. By restricting masks, the law limits female autonomy, reinforcing control over behavior. Yet, women find loopholes. They wear masks in secret gatherings or behind closed doors. Freedom often hides in shadows. Travel to the African savannah, 19th century. In some tribes, laws prohibit the use of certain colors or patterns in clothing for women, marking social roles and age. Violations can lead to exile or social ostracism. One young woman, Amina, refuses to accept these boundaries. She dyes her clothes with forbidden colors, declaring her identity boldly. Her defiance challenges tradition and sparks conversations about change. These laws, strange on the surface, expose tensions beneath society's order. The struggle between control and individuality, between tradition and transformation. Throughout history, these conflicts shape cultures and people. The strangest laws are mirrors. They reflect fears, desires, and the unyielding quest for identity. Because laws bind bodies, but they cannot bind the human spirit. And it is in this clash between law and life that history's most vivid stories unfold. Venice, 16th century. The canals shimmer under lantern light as merchants and nobles glide through narrow streets. But a curious law governs the city's masks during the carnival. Wearing a mask after sunset without a special permit is forbidden. The reason? To prevent secret plots and maintain public order. But Venice thrives on mystery and disguise. One night, a masked woman named Isabella slips through shadows, her face hidden beneath a delicate veil. She is a spy playing both sides in a deadly game of politics and love. The law aims to unmask deception, but Isabella uses it to hide truth. The mask, forbidden yet essential, becomes a weapon and a shield. Contrast this with 18th century England. A law bans excessive wigs worn by gentlemen. The extravagant, towering wigs of the aristocracy are taxed heavily to discourage ostentation and preserve class distinctions. But the more the government tries to control fashion, the more the elite rebel, adding feathers, jewels, and ridiculous heights. This strange law highlights how appearances carry power and how people resist control through creativity. Now travel to the plains of Mongolia, 13th century. A harsh decree bans the consumption of fermented mare's milk, arag, on sacred festival days. The law enforces religious purity and discipline. Yet, the nomads continue to celebrate with secret sips, blending faith and festivity. The law tries to regulate spirit and tradition, but tradition drinks on. In colonial America, a law forbids the sale of alcohol on Sundays to preserve the Sabbath's sanctity. But this prohibition leads to secret taverns and illegal parties, breeding rebellion. The law intended to protect morality instead sparks hidden defiance. This pattern repeats everywhere. The strangest laws, born from fear or control, ignite the human desire for freedom. In every mask, wig, or forbidden drink, there is a story of resistance. History teaches us that what is forbidden often becomes sacred. And in those forbidden acts, we find the pulse of humanity beating strongest. In ancient Persia, under the Achaemenid Empire, a peculiar law dictated that no one could wear shoes inside the royal palace. The palace floors were covered with delicate carpets and intricate mosaics meant to showcase the empire's wealth and artistry. Shoes, seen as dirty and disrespectful, were banned to preserve this splendor. But nobles and courtiers used to their shoes as symbols of status and authority struggled with the law. Some wore silk socks embroidered with gold threads to maintain prestige while obeying the rule. The law reveals a deeper tension, the desire to honor sacred space while maintaining social hierarchy. Now, journey to indigenous North America among the Iroquois Confederacy. A law forbids women from holding political office, yet women hold tremendous influence behind the scenes. Clan mothers select chiefs and advise councils. This apparent contradiction reveals a complex power dynamic. Women's power is real but hidden. Their influence weaves through law and custom like invisible threads, shaping the fate of nations. In forgotten European villages during the Middle Ages, a strange custom became law, Anyone who killed a wolf had to pay a tax to the local lord even if the wolf threatened livestock. Why? Because wolves were seen as part of the natural order and the lord claimed ownership of the forest. This law pits survival against authority. Farmers hunted wolves to protect their livelihood, yet were bound by law to compensate power. It shows how laws can trap people between survival and obedience. In every story, strange laws expose the fragile balance between power, identity, and survival. They reveal how people navigate control with cunning and courage. And through these tales, we see history not as distant dates but as lived human experience. The strangest laws are not just oddities, they are windows into the soul of humanity. Feudal Korea during the Joseon dynasty, a strict law forbade commoners from wearing clothing dyed with bright colors. Only the royal family and high-ranking officials could wear vibrant hues like red or purple. This rule visually reinforced social order, making status visible to all. One day, a humble farmer named Ji-hoon dared to dye his son's clothes in a brilliant red to celebrate a birth. When officials discovered this, Ji-hoon faced severe punishment. His defiance was a challenge to the rigid class system. This law shows how color became a silent language of power and exclusion. Yet, even under harsh restrictions, people found subtle ways to express individuality, a bright scarf here, a colorful bead there, small rebellions woven into fabric. Now consider the Ottoman Empire, 16th century. A law forbade non-Muslims from bearing arms or wearing certain types of clothing that resembled Muslim attire. This was part of the dhimmi system, which regulated the rights and status of religious minorities. But Christians and Jews in Ottoman cities often adapted, mixing styles, blending traditions. The law tried to draw clear lines, but life, complex and messy, blurred them. In Renaissance Italy, an odd decree required that courtiers wear gloves during certain ceremonies to prevent the spread of disease and to show respect. Gloves became a symbol of status and etiquette, but also a barrier. The law attempted to protect health but also controlled social interaction and intimacy. Imagine the internal conflict of a young noble longing to reach out but bound by protocol. Each law, strange as it seems, uncovers layers of human emotion, fear, pride, longing. And in these layers, history breathes. In Victorian England, the law forbade women from wearing trousers in public. Trousers were strictly a man's garment, symbolizing masculinity and authority. Women daring to cross this boundary risked arrest and public humiliation. But the early suffragettes and activists began to challenge this. One woman, Amelia, wore trousers to a rally, facing jeers and police alike. Her choice wasn't just about clothing, it was about claiming space, identity, and rights. This law tried to confine gender to rigid boxes. But rebellion found expression in fabric and form. In the Ottoman Empire, certain towns enforced a law requiring Jews to wear distinctive badges or clothing to mark their identity. This segregation was both a tool of control and exclusion. Yet, within their communities, people transformed these marks into symbols of pride and resilience, weaving stories of survival and faith. In colonial Australia, Aboriginal people were forbidden from speaking their native languages in schools and public places. This law aimed to erase culture and identity. But elders kept stories alive in secret gatherings, passing them down orally, preserving identity against erasure. This hidden resistance illustrates how laws may control bodies but struggle to contain spirit. Travel to medieval Scotland. A law prohibited wearing the tartan of certain clans under penalty of death as a way to suppress rebellion and assert royal control. Yet clans continued to wear tartan in secret, passing traditions through generations. The law's attempt to erase identity only made it stronger underground. Each of these laws reveals a pattern. Control breeds resistance. Suppression breeds identity. The strangest laws in history are less about rules, more about the struggle between power and freedom. Between who is allowed to be visible and who must hide. In that struggle, we find not just history, but the human story itself. In ancient Babylon, a law decreed that a man who falsely accused another without evidence would have his tongue cut out. This brutal punishment aimed to protect reputation and truth, but also instilled fear. Imagine the internal turmoil of someone tempted to speak out against injustice, only to be silenced by the threat. This law reveals a tension between justice and control. Now, in 17th century France, a peculiar law forbade women from wearing more than 3 layers of skirts. The reason was practical, to prevent fires in crowded theaters, but it also limited female display and movement. One actress, Marie, challenged this by crafting lighter, innovative costumes that defied the restrictions, blending art and rebellion. This law, meant to protect, became a canvas for creativity. In Qing dynasty China, a law required men to wear the queue, a long braid, as a symbol of loyalty to the emperor. Failure to comply meant execution. This law forced a cultural and personal identity shift, blending fear, loyalty, and resistance. Men who resisted risked death, yet some kept hidden locks in secret, preserving old identities. In colonial America, a law forbade the sale of books deemed dangerous to the colonial order. This censorship tried to suppress ideas. But underground pamphlets and secret libraries flourished, fueling revolution. History shows us that the strangest laws often seek to silence. But silence breeds defiance. And defiance writes history. In the dense streets of Renaissance Venice, the infamous Council of Ten passed a law forbidding citizens from engaging in public mourning for more than 3 days after a death. Grief, they argued, must be controlled to maintain order and prevent disorder. But the law clashed with human nature. Families desperate to honor lost loved ones found clandestine ways to extend mourning, secret vigils, whispered prayers, hidden symbols worn in silence. The tension between public order and private sorrow played out in shadowed corners. What does it mean when a government tries to regulate grief? Is mourning a threat to power? Far away, in ancient Egypt, the law dictated strict dress codes for priests who had to shave their heads and wear simple linen robes. The aim was purity and devotion. Yet, many priests secretly adorned themselves with jewelry and perfumes, small acts of personal identity and pride within rigid religious order. These laws, seemingly about appearance, actually managed deeper struggles of identity and authority. Jump to the American Wild West. A town ordinance prohibited women from carrying firearms within city limits, a rule designed to maintain order but rooted in gender bias. One woman, Clara, defied the law, carrying a hidden pistol to protect her family from bandits. Her defiance blurred lines of gender and power. This law tried to confine women's agency, but Clara's courage challenged that boundary. From Venice to the deserts of the American West, strange laws illuminate universal human conflicts. Control versus freedom. Order versus chaos. Visibility versus invisibility. Each law, bizarre or brutal, reveals the unspoken battles that shape societies. History's strangest laws are less about rules and more about the people caught between them. In the bustling markets of medieval Baghdad, a law was passed forbidding men from wearing silk garments except those in the highest ranks of government. Silk was prized not only for its beauty but for its symbolic connection to power and divine favor. One merchant, Harun, secretly commissioned silk robes, risking arrest to display his wealth and challenge the social hierarchy. This law masked a deeper fear, the erosion of established power by new wealth. Harun's quiet rebellion was not just about clothes, but about identity and ambition. Now, travel to 19th century Japan during the Meiji Restoration. A law mandated that all men cut their traditional topknots, a symbol of the samurai class, and adopt Western hairstyles. This was part of rapid modernization and social restructuring. For many samurai, this was a painful erasure of identity. One young samurai, Takashi, secretly kept his topknot hidden beneath a hat, clinging to his heritage amid sweeping change. This law shows how political shifts use appearance to enforce transformation, yet tradition resists beneath the surface. In colonial India, British rulers imposed a law requiring all subjects to carry identification papers, restricting movement and reinforcing control. Many resisted by traveling without papers or forging documents, acts of quiet defiance. This law reveals how control over identity and mobility is a tool of empire. Across continents and centuries, strange laws reveal the deep human struggles beneath surface order. They tell stories of power, resistance, identity, and survival. Because laws may dictate actions, but they cannot fully dictate the human spirit. And it is in the cracks of those laws that history's richest tales emerge. In medieval Europe, a curious law forbade peasants from baking bread on Sundays, reserving this day for church and rest. The rationale was religious observance, but it also controlled daily life and labor. One peasant woman, Agnes, defied this law to feed her starving family during a harsh winter. Her risk was immense, but survival trumped obedience. This law highlights the clash between imposed order and human necessity. In ancient Greece, laws dictated that only men of certain age and citizenship could wear the traditional himation cloak. Foreigners and slaves were banned from donning this garment, marking exclusion. Yet, slaves would steal fabric scraps to mimic the look, yearning for dignity. The law's attempt to define belonging met the human desire for respect and identity. In the Kingdom of Mali, a law required warriors to cut their hair short before battle, symbolizing readiness and humility. But some warriors secretly braided their hair, believing it held spiritual protection. This conflict between law and belief illustrates how rituals and identity intertwine with power. In 19th century Russia, serfs were forbidden from wearing boots made of fine leather, a privilege of the nobility. Yet, some serfs managed to obtain such boots secretly, stepping into forbidden status. Each strange law is a thread in the tapestry of history, weaving stories of power, defiance, and identity. They reveal how people navigate, resist, and transform the rules that bind them. Because beneath every law lies the pulse of humanity, unpredictable, resilient, and unyielding. In ancient Rome, a law forbade men from wearing purple togas unless they were senators or emperors. Purple dye was rare and expensive, symbolizing imperial authority. One ambitious merchant, Lucius, dared to wear a purple stripe on his toga, subtly pushing the boundaries of his social class. When officials confronted him, Lucius argued that wealth, not birth, should define status. This law revealed the tension between traditional power structures and emerging social mobility. Now, in Qing dynasty China, a peculiar law mandated that anyone growing facial hair must shave their heads in the Manchu style, known as the queue, as a sign of loyalty to the ruling dynasty. Men who resisted faced brutal punishment. One scholar, Wei, struggled with this law, torn between cultural identity and survival. His hidden rebellion, maintaining a secret beard beneath his queue, was a quiet act of defiance against cultural erasure. In colonial Africa, British rulers imposed laws regulating the use of traditional clothing, banning certain patterns and colors deemed tribal and threatening to colonial authority. Yet communities adapted, creating new styles that blended old and new, preserving identity in the face of oppression. In 18th century France, a law forbade women from riding horses astride, insisting they use the side saddle to preserve modesty. A noblewoman, Elizabeth, secretly practiced riding astride, seeking freedom in movement and spirit. This law controlled not just bodies but ideas of femininity and freedom. Each strange law, bizarre at first glance, opens windows into the heart of societies, into how power is asserted, resisted, and reimagined. They remind us that behind every rule lies a story of human courage and complexity. In medieval England, a law required all able-bodied men to carry bows and practice archery on Sundays and holidays. This law aimed to ensure military readiness but also created social tension. One young man, Thomas, hated the bow and longed for a peaceful life. Yet, defying the law risked punishment. Torn between duty and desire, he secretly practiced in solitude, hiding his skill from his family. This law reveals how authority demands sacrifice of personal freedom for collective power. In Tokugawa, Japan, a strict law mandated that commoners wear plain, undyed clothing to distinguish them from the samurai class. The stark contrast was a daily reminder of social order. But some commoners secretly dyed their garments with bright colors, asserting individuality beneath rigid class structures. The law tried to enforce invisibility. Their defiance was a quiet rebellion woven into threads. In 19th century America, many states had laws forbidding the teaching of enslaved people to read and write. Literacy was seen as dangerous, a path to freedom. One enslaved woman, Harriet, risked everything to learn secretly, using stolen moments by candlelight. This law tried to silence minds but sparked a flame of hope. Each strange law shows the constant tension between control and freedom, visibility and invisibility. History is not just about rulers and laws, it is about those who live, resist, and dream beneath them. Because in the shadows of strange laws, the human spirit shines brightest. In ancient Athens, a law prohibited women from wearing jewelry in public, aiming to reinforce modesty and social order. Yet, women like Dion found subtle ways to display their beauty, delicate threads woven into their hair, or intricate patterns embroidered on their cloaks. This law reveals a struggle between imposed restraint and personal expression. Dion's quiet defiance transformed everyday fabric into a canvas of identity. Moving eastward to the Ottoman Empire, a law required non-Muslims to pay a special tax, the jizya, marking them as second-class citizens. This tax was more than financial, it was a symbol of exclusion. But communities turned this burden into a shared identity, using the resources to build schools, hospitals, and places of worship. Here, law imposed division, but human resilience forged unity. In medieval Iceland, a law banned women from owning land independently. Property ownership was a source of power and security. Yet, women like Gurn navigated the system through marriage, inheritance, and clever alliances, securing influence in subtle ways. This law reveals how formal rules often clash with lived realities. In the early United States, blue laws forbade activities like selling alcohol on Sundays to uphold moral standards. But underground speakeasies thrived, fueled by human desire for pleasure and community. These laws, often strict and public, sparked hidden worlds of resistance. Across time and place, strange laws reflect more than rules. They reveal human conflict, adaptation, and spirit. They tell us that control is never absolute, that identity finds cracks to shine through, and that history lives in the stories of those who dared to live beyond the law's limits. In medieval France, a curious law forbade peasants from wearing silk or fine fabrics. These materials were reserved exclusively for the nobility, a visual reminder of the rigid social hierarchy. One day, a humble weaver named Jacques crafted a delicate silk scarf for his wife in secret. When caught, the punishment was severe, but the scarf became a symbol of defiance and love. This law tried to freeze social order in fabric, but human passion wove its own patterns. Across the sea in Ming Dynasty China, a law required women to bind their feet tightly, conforming to beauty standards and social control. Young girls like Mei suffered pain daily, caught between tradition and personal freedom. This law is a stark example of how appearance can be a tool of oppression. Yet some secretly unbound their feet at night, yearning for liberation. In the American South during segregation, laws forbade black citizens from using the same facilities as whites. But in small communities, people created their own spaces, churches, schools, businesses, turning exclusion into resilience. The law attempted to divide, but it also forged identity and solidarity. In medieval Japan, samurai were forbidden from engaging in trade or commerce, a law meant to preserve their warrior status. But some samurai, like Katsuro, ran secret businesses, balancing honor and survival. This law highlights the tension between societal roles and human necessity. Strange laws, often born from fear and control, reveal the complex dance of power and resistance. They remind us that laws are not static, they are lived, challenged, and transformed. History's strangest laws shine a light on the enduring human spirit that pushes beyond boundaries. In 17th century England, a peculiar law banned the wearing of high-heeled shoes by men. High heels were associated with aristocracy and power, and this law aimed to keep the social hierarchy clear. But many men ignored the rule, hiding their heels or wearing them in private. One nobleman, Edward, defied the law openly, sparking scandal but also admiration. This law tried to regulate status through fashion, but desire for distinction persisted. In ancient Egypt, priests were required by law to shave their entire bodies as a sign of purity. Yet, some secretly kept patches of hair, small rebellions against rigid religious norms. This law reveals how control over bodies reflects deeper struggles for autonomy and belief. In 19th century Russia, laws restricted the movement of Jews, confining them to the Pale of Settlement. Families torn apart, dreams deferred, yet communities thrived in adversity, building rich cultural lives despite legal cages. This law shows how physical boundaries attempt to control identity, but spirit finds ways to transcend. In colonial Australia, Aboriginal people were forbidden from practicing traditional ceremonies. Elders risked punishment, but ceremonies were held in secret, preserving culture against erasure. Laws meant to silence voices became catalysts for resilience. Across centuries and continents, strange laws exposed the friction between power and humanity. They reveal that beneath every strange rule lies a story of resistance, hope, and identity. Because laws may try to bind us, but they cannot fully contain the human spirit. The strangest laws in history are often windows into the deepest struggles of human societies, battles over power, identity, freedom, and survival. These laws, at first glance bizarre or harsh, reveal something universal: the desire to control appearances, behaviors, and even thoughts to maintain social order or reinforce authority. Take the sumptuary laws that forbade commoners from wearing certain colors or fabrics. These laws painted social hierarchies not just in words but in visible symbols. But when a humble farmer dyed his child's clothes bright red in defiance, or a merchant donned forbidden purple, they were challenging the very fabric of society, literally. The tension between the law and personal expression created a silent battlefield where identity was asserted thread by thread. Then there were laws regulating gender through clothing, like Victorian England's ban on women wearing trousers or 18th century France's requirement that noblewomen ride side saddle. These rules were not merely about garments but about who gets to move freely in society and how. When a woman secretly wore trousers to a rally or practiced riding astride, she was not just breaking fashion rules, she was stepping into power, claiming space denied to her. The control extended even to physical bodies. Foot binding in Ming China and the mandatory shaving of priests' heads in ancient Egypt weren't just cultural customs but laws enforcing conformity and submission. Yet beneath those strict appearances, small acts of rebellion flourished, a secret unbinding of feet at night, a hidden patch of hair kept for oneself. These tiny defiance gestures are reminders that laws may govern bodies, but they cannot fully govern spirit. Strange laws also targeted speech and knowledge. Ancient Babylon's brutal punishment for false accusations or 19th century America's forbidding literacy among enslaved people tried to control what people could say and know. Yet, underground pamphlets, secret schools, whispered stories thrived. When authorities clamp down on voice, they inadvertently ignite the fire of resistance. Identity and belonging were tightly controlled by laws dictating who could wear what, where people could live, and how they could move. The Ottoman Empire's jizya tax marking non-Muslims, colonial India's requirement for identification papers, or Russia's Pale of Settlement all sought to segregate and diminish groups. But within those constraints, communities found ways to survive, adapt, and even thrive, turning imposed divisions into sources of cultural pride. Even laws aimed at preserving public order or morality, like bans on public mourning in Renaissance Venice or blue laws forbidding Sunday commerce, often clashed with human emotion and desire. Secret vigils, hidden speakeasies, and subtle acts of defiance blossomed in the shadows, reminding us that life always finds cracks to seep through. The strangest laws often reveal a fundamental human drama, the tension between control and freedom, between the desire of rulers to impose order and the resilient spirit of people who resist, adapt, and dream beyond those bounds. These laws are not just relics of the past but echoes of the ongoing struggle every society faces. In the end, laws are tools to shape society, to signal who belongs and who doesn't, who has power and who is excluded. But they can never fully cage the human heart with its yearning for identity, dignity, and freedom. History's strangest laws are stories of power, but more importantly, they are stories of resistance. Of people who, against odds, refuse to be invisible, refuse to be silenced, and refuse to stop dreaming. Because where laws draw lines, the human spirit draws bridges. Subscribe for more stories that unravel the hidden threads of our past.